Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Weiner Museum of Decorative Arts. My name is Louise Irvine. I'm the Executive Director and Curator here at the museum. It's my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the museum here to our Art Deco celebration. Has anybody been at this location before? Oh, we've got a few. And what about the other location where we were in Dania? Oh, yeah. Great. Well, it's good that you're all back and you can do all the compare and contrast that you enjoy with our two locations. But we're thrilled to be open again here at a new location in Hollywood. And we're particularly celebrating this weekend Art Deco. It is 100 years since the Art Deco movement was launched at the Paris exhibition of 1925. And this was a big turning point in design and style. It wasn't actually called Art Deco way back then. It took its name after the fact. It wasn't until the 1960s that they started talking about the Art Deco movement. But they took the name because it was the Exposition des Arts Décoratifs et Industriels, so Art Deco became the name of the movement. And the thing that was important about the movement and that started at this Paris exhibition was that everything had to be modern. The exhibition committee insisted that all the decorative arts that were on show were modern. And so they didn't want any historical styles. So it really did change a whole direction as far as design was concerned. This was the exhibition in Paris where it was all began. And you can see even in the poster, it has a beautiful woman with a gazelle or a deer of some sort representing speed and innovation and modernity. And on the right, a design by Reuter, the company, a German porcelain factory, taking up some of the spirit of that particular motif. We're going to introduce you today to all of the flappers, vamps and divas that we have here at WMODA. After I've given my presentation, we'll go through into the Art Deco gallery and we'll have a look at all the different figures that I'm going to talk to you about. But you'll meet a lot of lovely ladies in the Art Deco gallery. Women came to the fore in the 1920s, and one of the reasons was that they finally got the vote. After a lot of campaigning in different parts of the world. In Canada, they achieved it in 1917, in the UK, 1918, the USA, 1920, and then Cuba in 1933. And it was typically from the work that they had done during the First World War that they had proved themselves equal to having the vote. But how did they express it now that women could come to the fore and have the vote? Well, many of them became flappers, particularly if they were young women. They had the opportunity to dress up in a different way, far different from their mothers and their grandmothers before them. They cut off their hair, which shocked the older generation. Long flowing locks were out, short bobbed hair was in. They compressed themselves into tube-like dresses. So again, the wasp waist of their parents was gone. And more horrifying, they shortened their skirts. Short skirts, how could they expose such flesh? But this was the new look of the liberated ladies of the 1920s. They were listening to jazz as well, which was even more horrifying. So all in all, these young women were taking the stage by storm with this new look. And the companies in Britain and in Europe were there to record them in this way. Royal Doulton, Rosenthal, Reuter, Goldscheider are documenting the fashions of this era. This is a Royal Doulton figure, Miss 1927, and it seems to me she looks very much like Constance Bennett in her fur stole around the neck. So these porcelain factories were very much looking at the fashions of the time that they saw in women's magazines, but they're also looking at pin-up postcards where you could see your stars of the era and show that this was the look that they were trying to capture in the art of the period. If you were a vamp, you were something else entirely. The word's derived from vampires, and they're also known to many as femme fatales, and typically they're very alluring and very seductive, lots of innuendos in their conversation, but they can also ensnare men. They're very dangerous women. They tended to be told that they came from far off exotic places, and so the movie stars like Theda Bara were playing roles like Salome and Cleopatra, and this was very exotic and tantalizing. So I'm sure the men didn't get too concerned about being captivated in this way. But here's the Goldscheider factory from Austria, portraying Laura Vigand, who was a dancer of the period in her exotic Egyptian costume. And it shows just how very close these costumes were to the porcelain figure that resulted. They really studied these very, very closely. Perhaps the biggest vamp that you might have heard of was Mae West, and she outraged the censors with her stage performances, and then when she took to the film, she was even more outrageous, and they got very concerned about all of her double entendre and all the allusions that she was making, which was not considered appropriate. But her fashions were also iconic. She's shown here with one of the beautiful hats of the period. She's shown also in the 1930s. And she has her fashion accessories, her beautiful borzoi dogs, which represented speed and modernity as well as being great canine companions. Goldscheider's done a very good job of capturing that look and feel of that moment. The other influence at the time was the Russian ballet, the Ballet Russe, and they pounded their way across Europe, dancing in all these exotic costumes, Scheherazade being one of the most popular of their performances. And again, they're very much focused on an exotic Middle East. Schwarzberger, another German factory, portraying two of their dancers from Scheherazade. So all these influences are being felt, so they're bringing this exoticism to the world at large. But what about a diva? Well, they're typically women of outstanding talent, and it was usually applied to singers in opera, but it gradually widened to mean a woman who was involved and outstanding in any cultural activity. But we also know the other side of it all, which is a diva attitude, a woman who is difficult to please. And you can see one of the most difficult to please women in the porcelain industry here, Miss Daisy McKay Jones. Daisy worked for Wedgwood in the early 1900s, and you see her portrayed in the cartoon at the side as the Colossus of Wedgwood, and her poor little staff members cowering in the background. She was a formidable influence, but she was also a huge talent, and without her, Wedgwood wouldn't be telling the same story today. She designed a range which is known as Wedgwood's Fairyland Lusterware, and she was inspired by the fairy tales that she had grown up with in her youth. It's beautiful to look at, iridescent colors, 6 times fired to achieve these lustrous effects. And all of the scenes, as you look more deeply, involve little fairy-type creatures involved in a beautiful landscape of a fantasy garden or something of the sort. People really did believe in fairies at that time. This was a photograph taken by a pair of young girls in the Yorkshire area of England in the early 1900s. It became known as the Cottingley fairy photographs. The striking thing is that so many people believed that these photographs were real, that these little girls had actually photographed fairies dancing at the bottom of their garden. One of the people who believed more than others was Arthur Conan Doyle, who wrote Sherlock Holmes. You might have thought he might have more understanding of the world, but he believed in fairies until the day he died, and he helped authenticate the Cottingley fairies. These little fairy characters found their way into Daisy's work, but she doesn't typically always do the fairies that are in gauzy little dresses or diaphanous wings. She is doing often mischievous, impish type, fairy type characters, sometimes set against a midnight background, sometimes against a sunset. We have the biggest collection of Wedgwood Fairyland luster in the world here on display at WMODA, and they really are extraordinary and striking to enjoy. Daisy was very much influenced by popular book illustrators of the period. This is the work of Kay Nielsen. It was the golden age of picture book illustration at that time, and she took a lot of source material to help her with her storytelling on the bone china body. Two pieces that you'll see in flash in the gallery. On the right, that's Bubbles, and on the left, Ghostly Wood. And I'll tell you more about these little particular designs when we get into the gallery. And look out also in our Dragon Room for the largest piece of Fairyland luster ever produced, which is the Dragon King vase, and his queen, the Dragon Queen, on the table adjacent to it. So we'll go and look at these pieces in person, but really, if it hadn't been for Daisy and her rise to fame for Wedgwood, probably the Wedgwood story would look very differently today. They were really extraordinarily popular. They were expensive for the luxury market, but they really commanded a lot of attention both then and now because their popularity and collectability in the world stage. Women made a huge impact in the pottery industry at large. Here we are in the city of Stoke-on-Trent in England. Has anybody been to Stoke-on-Trent? Oh wow, that's unusual. We had a lady in the front in the audience yesterday who was also there. But it's not part of the tourist trail of England. It's not necessarily the most beautiful part of England to visit, but if you're interested in ceramic industry, it's a must-see opportunity. It was mainly staffed by women. Women were the decorators, the painters, but gradually through the 1920s, people like Daisy started to emerge and be recognized as designers and even directors in that period. One of the foremost was a lady called Clarice Cliff. Miss Cliff was typical of many girls in her era. She started work at the age of 13 years old, but she rose to become the art director of the factory that she worked at, which was called Wilkinson. And she rose because of her beautiful use of color, which really impacted the community at that time. There's even a movie about her rags to riches type story, which starred Phoebe Dynevor, which if you could ever get hold of it, it's well worth viewing. The colour room shows the remarkable use of colour that Clarice brought to the pottery industry. We have to remember this was an era when the drab surroundings of First World War still prevailed and people lived in greys and browns and very boring sort of colours. And with her new bizarre wear, as her work was called, she launched onto the stage with something completely different to offer. Not only was the work very colourful, it also had a new sense of style. The motifs were more geometric than previously. In the Art Nouveau era, things had been naturalistic and curved and more plant-inspired, but by the 20s and into the 30s, the machine prevailed and a new sense of geometry and abstraction start to come into the story. And this is what she's offering to the marketplace, a whole new look at ceramics, not just in terms of the surface decoration with her color, but also with the designs of the pieces. She was acknowledged in her time as being the art director of Wilkinson's, but more recently she's been acknowledged with a blue plaque, which is sited in her home in Staffordshire. And those are acknowledging people who have lived in buildings. When you go around London, you see lots of blue plaques with famous people who lived there. But that's quite an accolade to have a blue plaque for a pottery designer. She also worked in a blue color palette. This is her study of the work of Eduardo Benedictus, Benedictus was an exhibitor at the Paris exhibition in 1925, and Clarice got to visit, and then she came away with some beautiful pochoir prints that he'd created, and then she weaves them in as inspiration to her own designs. The other piece that you'll see on display is this unusual mask. It was fashionable in the 20s to hang masks of women on your wall. It was the days where masquerade parties were all the rage, and this is Clarice's offering to that vogue. You can see even masks are appearing on popular magazine covers of the era, and you'll see this one on display in our Art Deco gallery. You have to go upstairs to our Cheers exhibition to see her teapot designs and her jugs and teacups. They really weren't easy to use. I mean, these little handles and very impractical. And when you think you're working with a steaming pot of tea, trying to hold it like that. But this is design giving way to practicality in this instance. A cup of tea, very refreshing and more prevalent during the days of Prohibition, which of course was a big issue in the United States in the 20s. It's hard to imagine how it became known, the Roaring 20s, with no alcohol to fuel it, but it did. But people made their own kind of arrangements, as you probably heard. They would go to speakeasies, they would travel abroad in the hope that they could, on ocean liners to Europe, they could escape the ban. They could also make their own cocktails at home, and the giggle water being a popular drink of the moment. We'll give you some giggle water later when we come back in after our guided tour, but only if you promise to behave for the next lecture. The speakeasy, though, was where everybody hung out in the Great Gatsby, where you could see the women of the time, the flappers. And I always think it's somewhat unusual, the fact that the movies at the time were promoting exotic drinks, whereas Prohibition firmly prohibited them. But Manhattan Cocktail and the Dry Martini, these were movies of 1928 when the ban was still very much in force. Hollywood, the city where we are now, it celebrates its 100th anniversary this year as well. So we've got a double celebration, not just the centennial of Art Deco, but Hollywood City itself, hence our celebrations. When we look back to what Hollywood looked like in the 1920s, thanks to vintage postcards, and you can see them out on the Broadwalk there in their skimpy bathing suits. And here we have the artists of Royal Doulton and Rosenthal capturing those moments with their figure stories. Royal Doulton here in the center with the swimmer, and some popular movies of the time celebrating life and culture in South Florida. But there, it is the bathing suits that are outraging the older generation. Victorian ladies liked to swim as well, but they typically went into the sea covered from head to toe with voluminous bathing gowns. It was considered indecent to expose your flesh. Certainly you couldn't have appeared anything like the Sunshine Girl here, which is a Royal Doulton iconic figure from that era. But the women were not, even in the 20s, supposed to be exposing so much flesh that you see in these studies by Royal Doulton and again by Rosenthal. When you see that the police were out in force on Palm Beach and in the northern seaports as well, making sure that your bathing suit was no more than 6 inches above your knee, because if it was, you would be carted out in the police van. You'd be arrested for being indecent on the beach. So they reacted not just to the length of your costume, but the figure-hugging aspect of it was considered not appropriate. And heaven help you if you showed up on the beach looking like this. This figure by Royal Doulton is called the Bather. And we note the similarities between the back of the figure and this advertisement from the 1920s. It's for Cyclax bath salts, and apparently they maintain that you could renew your youth in your daily bath. And if you read in more detail, you'll hear that it was also possible to get rid of superfluous flesh by getting into a bath of Cyclax salts. I'm sure they didn't have advertising standards control back in those days. But it does bring out a point that nudity was perfectly acceptable for your ornaments in the 1920s. And it did change, atmosphere and approach changed by the 30s. And our nude bather was given a decorous little black bathing suit painted on. But it's exactly the same model, revamped for the 1930s. However, the story was a little bit different, particularly in continental Europe, and particularly in Germany. And we're heading to Weimar, Berlin, in the period where after the First World War, the government was very concerned about the standards that people were living under. They were going to cabarets, louche cabarets, they were going to drinking dens and establishments. It was really inappropriate, their behavior. So the government put together this film. It's become a cult film very quickly, and it was known as Ways to Strength and Beauty. And what they advocated was that you came out of the cabarets of the period and you started to dance and do exercise, get back to nature and make yourself a healthier, fitter person. And they encourage you to do this with no clothes on as well. And so this was reflected in the industry in Germany. The porcelain factories of Hütchenreiter and Rosenthal in particular are portraying these dancers of the period. Excuse me. I'm sorry. I've got a bit of a cold coming on. Hopefully. Hopefully I'll get my voice back. Yeah, it's back. Excuse me, I'm so sorry about that. But anyway, the ladies who were prancing around without clothes, here they are on a riding on an ostrich by the Rosenthal factory. They like to associate beautiful young women with animals, sleek animals that represented movement and vitality. But this is quite an unusual combination of the lady balanced on an ostrich, and you'll see that in the studio in the gallery next door. So sorry. So the next ones actually show them with hounds, dogs, and deer in their athletic outfits. And if you were even more exotic, like Josephine Baker, you could have a cheetah as one of your animal companions. She had Chiquita, the cheetah, who followed her everywhere. And there's a Hütchenreiter figure showing the cheetah, which was much admired because of the speed that the animal could ride in. And the idea of speed was very important for the modern movement. We don't actually have any pieces by Josephine, any pieces representing Josephine at the studio in the Deco gallery, but we do have some pieces by a contemporary artist who's much in love with Josephine, and she has created a whole range of vases showing Josephine in her inspiration. Another artist who has created the Lenchi range was a lady called Elena Koenig, and she was very much an artist who had been responsible for creating a doll connection previously, and then she had created our factory making porcelain figures. And she managed this factory entirely, so it's quite unusual for women of the time to do that. And her range of dolls was succeeded with a range of nude statuary, often again combined with unusual animals like elephants and hippos. And there's a young woman sitting on top of the world at that point. The dancing movement, it felt itself on all the different stages, both in terms of the opportunity to go out onto the dance floor, but also onto the stage and also into the movies. So we see it reflected, Hutchenreuter, Rosenthal, and all of these factories of the period. This is probably one of the greatest stars of the period. This is a lady called Loie Fuller, and she took the stage by storm in Paris in the early 1900s. And she's dancing with the aid of voluminous fabric, which she has on extended poles at the end of her arms. And she's waving these fabrics around, and on her is projected color lights. And so she's known as the Electric Fairy because of this amazing dancing that she was doing. And this also became a big influence on the Art Deco dancing. Isadora Duncan, the other great dancer artist of the time, she's also influenced a wide range of porcelain figures with the dancers all in their gowns of the era. This is a work by Fanny Rosé, and Fanny was a huge influence as well, but she also helped to break the glass ceiling because she was one of the few female artists who were able to come into the art schools that were dominated by men of the time, and she was able to study sculpture in Paris, which was really extraordinary for the era that she was allowed in to do that. So the women are coming to the fore both as designers and sculptors and artists in a way that had never happened before. The fashions of the period you can see reflected throughout the gallery. In the collection next door, you'll see them wearing lounging pajamas, which again offended the older generation because women were not supposed to be wearing trousers. But there's a new look that prevailed in the 1930s because skirts designed to be above the knee for the flappers started to descend again to floor length. And this lady's looking straight out of a 1930s Hollywood movie. We've been able to link very closely some of the porcelain designs to the artists of the period. There's Clara Bow, and she seemed to be the inspiration for something like Dreamland. And this young lady has come back from a fancy dress party of the period, and at her foot is a poupée, or French for a doll. And ladies in the flapper period used to go out to the parties of the period accompanied by their poupée dolls. And they would dance with them and have conversations with them and bring them home at night to enjoy with their conversations would continue. So they became sort of doll companions. It was a fashionable motif. Here we have a Royal Doulton figure again showing this new fashions of the 30s. It was the start of the Depression. It changed the way that women dressed, new gowns coming to floor length, but also lots of swathes of fabric, and the new erogenous zone became the shoulders and the back. And Dolores Del Rio is showing that extraordinary costume that links with Royal Doulton's rhythm figure. The other occupation of the bright young things of the 20s and 30s was to go to the masquerade balls, and very often they would go dressed as Pierrettes and Pierrots, or perhaps lady clowns and harlequins, and those kind of costumes became all the rage through the 20s and 30s. Even the Saturday Post in America is showing the great influence of the Commedia dell'arte, the Italian improvised comedy, and how they could affect the designs of women's fashions even centuries later. The Harlequinade look from Harlequin and Columbine again made its way into the movies. There's Claudette Colbert and a Royal Doulton figure showing just how popular this look was. But all the young women flappers aspired to being butterflies. This was the most popular costume of the time. And here you can see them flapping their wings. Life magazine and Royal Doulton's interpretation of the butterfly costume. And they were just one of many at the time. Goldscheider, Carl Enns, also doing exotic butterfly women. This dancer, Nidhi Impikoven, made a role for herself as a captured bird. She danced around on the stage, flapping her wings and pretending to be a caged bird. And Goldscheider, the Austrian company, they have continued to be inspired by that dancer, and this is one of their great studies of the 20s. Goldscheider, perhaps more than any, reflected the love of the pin-up girls and the stars of the time, and we've been able to make connections exactly to the star that inspired specific figures. Lillian Harvey was a ballerina come dancer on the silver screen, and there is Goldscheider's beauty reflecting exactly her pose and performance. Goldscheider also followed what was going on the cabaret stage as well, and you can see all of the feathers and fans from the cabaret era, and their figure of fascination shown here, a little bit more louche in terms of the approach to the design and reflecting the cabaret lifestyle of the 20s and 30s. And this is a figure by Lalique. We're tasting the glass world, and Lalique was formerly a jewelry designer in Paris in the early 1900s. But he discovered glass, and he became so involved in glass that he decided he was going to open his own factory specializing in glass art. And by the time that he had reached the 1925 Paris exhibition, Lalique had become so famous that he only was required to do this huge monument in glass in the centerpiece of the Paris exhibition. So he had really become the sort of leader in Art Deco glass. And it all started because he was commissioned to make perfume bottles for Coty. It started with a small commission and led to a whole industry, because his commission for Coty then led him to develop new techniques for mass producing glass, and then from there to having processes for carving glass, for casting glass. Of course, the factory, as many of you will know, still exists today. Some of the most striking designs date from the 20s and 30s era, and you'll see them in our Art Nouveau, Art Deco gallery. One of the things you don't see in the shops today, however, are the radiator caps. And it was once fashionable to have Rolls-Royce and other illustrious vehicles of the period to have a figurative radiator cap and made of glass. And so the young women that were used as the adornment on the hood were often representing speed or movement, reflecting again the car. We've stocked the museum shop for this occasion with some beautiful glass and beautiful jewelry that have an Art Deco flavor. This is the work of Sherry Donato, who is doing fused glass art. She was inspired by our Art Deco program to do some very Deco type designs. So do spend some time in the museum shop. It would be lovely to think that you were helping to support the museum. We are a 501c3 not-for-profit, and all the sales in the museum go towards the educational programs that we're able to run here. You can also have fun with our trivia trail, so hot off the press, we have our new Roaring Twenties trail. You all have one on your seat. So on another occasion, you can come and enjoy the Roaring Twenties and relive it here at WMODA. I wanted to mention a few things coming up in the future. because we do have here today Chelsea Russo. Do you want to give a wave, Chelsea? Chelsea is our leading glass artist, and she is going to be, she's back at WMODA to do one of her glass classes, fused glass classes, and this time she's going to show us how to make beautiful fazzoletto style bowls, and she's brought a couple of them around so that we can see, and you can imagine yourself making something like this, and she's going to take you step by step through the process. Essentially, you're working with strips of glass and patches of glass, whatever the pieces of glass, and you're making the design flat. And then after she's helped you to create your first design, she takes it away and fires it, and then she's also slumping it so that it creates the bowl form. And then what will happen is 2 weeks after the class, she'll bring it back and we'll have a grand reveal of all your artwork here at WMODA. A lot of fun doing her classes, so I urge you to take a look. She does have some leaflets with her about the class. Another thing that's happening next week at WMODA, we're opening a new exhibition. It's called Carved in Glass. It features the work of Ricardo Ferro, who's a Murano glass artist, and he's carving and cold working in glass, sometimes up to 5 layers deep, in order to create his brilliant designs. So that's something else that's happening. One way to keep in touch with everything we're doing at the museum is to become a member of our new membership society. Again, we've got these on your desk and on your seats. And this is brand new for us, so we only got these printed at the weekend. They arrived yesterday, so we have many of our founder members already. It will be also online next week. Towards the end of next week, you can do it online, but you can do it in person here. And this is going to be a great way to stay in touch with the museum and to have free admission to the museum for the rest of the year. It's an annual membership on the anniversary of your joining, and you will get discounts in the shop and other treats in store. And we also, as some of you already know, put out a monthly newsletter which is promoting the museum and all of our activities, stories about the collection, but it also gives you first-hand information of what's going on in the future, so you can book up early to enjoy the programs. And here we want you to continue to celebrate the museum, to celebrate the Roaring 20s. We're going to go and have a little look around the Art Deco gallery now and see some of the pieces that I've referenced, and then you'll get to come back into this room and to have some giggle water and some sweet treats and tarts and enjoy the rest of the afternoon's program.